The complexity point on the AP exam on the LEQ and DBQ is obviously very hard to acquire. Here's the rubric here, you can look at it. But one way that you can maybe move towards getting it, even though, like I said, it's very hard to acquire, is start integrating analogies and making insightful connections across time periods. So that's what I tried to do here with you. An analogy, by the way, is a comparison that is used for explaining. So make sure your analogies or the historical connections that you're making in your essays uh, are relevant to the arguments that you're making as well. So check them out, check the list that I compiled, and please feel free to message me or talk to me about adding more. So this document is organized. I gave you the topic generally and then possible prompts that would expect you to answer or relate to that topic. Then I gave you the content knowledge, either that or references to the Princeton Review where you can find that content knowledge that you would need to know to address the prompt. And then I gave you the historical analogies or connections that I thought of. And then either links to help you learn about that connection more, or not necessarily that connection, but learn individually about that connection independent of making the connection. You have to make the connection. And then references again to the Princeton Review. Obviously, this document will be available in Google Classroom. All the underlined blue text is hyperlinks that you'll be able to access via Google Classroom. The first one's Bubonic Plague, and I think some of the historical analogies that you can draw relate to maybe potentially events that are going on right now. You can talk about the present in your essays. You can talk about COVID-19 and the spread of the coronavirus kind of as this consequence of increasing global integration or globalization. The same was true, the Mongols helped, the Pax Mongolica during the 14th century really kind of helped unify the Eurasian continent. There was an expansion of trade, and with that expansion, increased connectivity came the consequence of the spread of pandemic diseases, infectious diseases. If there's a prompt, obviously that prompt is not very good. That's just one I came up with, and I'm very tired. But there was a prompt that asked you to or didn't ask you necessarily to compare European and Japanese feudalism, but you can bring in those connections and explain that in some insightful way and address a prompt. Pax Mongolica is more interesting because you could talk about Pax Americana, and then in there I included a New York Times, I think it's an opinion article, talking about Pax Americana. Pax Mongolica and Pax Americana, Pax Mongolica was established by a group of nomads that were known for being incredibly brutal, but yet they managed to create, great political stability in the Mongol peace. And so there seems to be some sort of tension there. The same is true for the United States. The United States is kind of viewed today as the preserver of a type of order in the world. They're often called the policemen in the world by detractors. People refer detractors of the United States both internally to the United States and externally call the United States an empire. And they use empire in a pejorative sense that kind of flouts international rules and norms when it sees fit. So you can talk and speak to the tensions in both Pax Mongolica and Pax Americana to really create a really cool and insightful argument. Even if the prompt is just wanting you to talk about Pax Mongolica or talk about the impact and effects of the Mongols' conquest, you can bring in that analogy really effectively. So trade routes, I just really want you to go back and be able to, if they ask you about a specific trade route, be able to compare, with other trade routes. So just go back and look at those Princeton Review pages. The Protestant Reformation, the actual split, the schism that takes place between Catholicism and Protestantism, it causes a lot of political, social effects and economic effects well beyond the theological effects. And you can relate that to the Sunni-Shia split, which is a disagreement that originates about who should basically inherit the Islamic Caliphate or the Islamic political and religious community that Muhammad founds in the 7th century. So that still has impact today. Sunnis and Shias in the Middle East, for example, the main Shia power in the Middle East is Iran, and the main Sunni power in the Middle East is Saudi Arabia, and they've been said to kind of engage in this Cold War and use the fact that different people identify as Sunnis and Shias as a way to kind of convince people um, to uh, sever their allegiances, so to speak, with the other, or they're kind of, I should say, exacerbating those fault lines that may be insignificant, but for political aims. Or maybe these fault lines are significant. Maybe the fact someone is a Sunni and Shia is significant, and the tension between those two theological beliefs has profound political, social, and economic effects. So being able to draw on that is super important. So go ahead and look at those links. So we can talk about the mandate of heaven and the divine right. If there's a prompt that wants you to talk about the effects of political philosophy of the Enlightenment on European politics, you can talk about how the social contract kind of erodes the authority of European kings. Um, and you can talk about and compare how the mandate of heaven was a more modern form, so to speak. If the mandate of heaven is an essential component of Chinese legitimacy for centuries, it's a more modern form because it already has baked into the process that the ruler does have a mandate from heaven, is given authority from heaven, but they're expected to deliver on earth. And if they don't deliver, then the people already have that ability, that mandate of heaven goes away and that authority goes away. In the divine right, none of that really exists. That mechanism for getting rid of the king doesn't exist before social contract theory and the Enlightenment. That's when that mechanism is put in place. So you can talk and compare those two and really create a cool argument. You can compare czars and the current president of Russia. There's all kinds of articles. These are just a couple that I found in the rightmost column that compare the way Vladimir Putin rules Russia today as a czar. He's likened to a czar. So doing that wouldn't be wrong. And we are going to learn about Putin in Unit 9. So please do that. You can compare, make that analogy both ways, and talk about the way Ivan the Terrible uses state terror with the way Vladimir Putin does. Talked about this at length, but the Ming Dynasty's treasure fleets, and them being like exorbitant and these really pricey fleets, could be analogous to the United States' decision to spend billions of dollars on the moon landing. Which doesn't really have any major material benefits, but certainly you can see that the state does care about its status and the way others view it in the international system. You can talk about periods of isolationism under the Tokugawa shogunate and the effectiveness of it. What were the causes of it? You can compare it with, there's a long history of American isolationism. You can compare it with Chinese isolationism. Any one of those could be a topic, and could be a prompt requiring you respond to that, right? I just randomly picked the Tokugawa shogunate. You can compare it to isolationism within the context of fearing foreign influence, specifically European influence, and European and even American want to access markets at the barrel of a gun. You can conceptualize isolationism as being very empowering, as it seems to be leading to cultural developments in the Tokugawa shogunate, or as very also limiting. The Tokugawa shogunate did not have access to the technologies that Commodore Matthew Perry had. He came with a steamboat, basically knocking on Japan's door, demanding concessions because the United States was in search of markets in the 19th century. So talking about isolationism, using these analogies to make your argument more formidable, um, whatever that argument may be, whatever that prompt is, please do that. European imperialism. You can talk about, depending on what the prompt is, Cold War interventions. I already tried to make this connection for you before. That from the perspective of the people in the third world or the global south, um, you know, Soviet and Americans intervening in their affairs, trying to determine the political direction of their affairs, which is almost it seems the same thing as European imperialism. You can talk about the brutality maybe of it. You know, the Soviets were kind of brutal in their interventions. So were Americans in their interventions as well. They propped up dictatorships. You know, you can talk about the brutality of those interventions, the brutality of imperialism itself. There's all kinds of references to that. You can talk about maybe German imperialism as well in the context of its short empire building, or maybe in the context of it building empires across the third world. This analogy has been made. Hitler invades the Soviet Union in the winter, and that has not gone very well for Napoleon in the 19th century. So making that analogy, you can talk about the fall of the Soviet Union and talk about how the Soviet Union was bogged down in a gruesome war in Afghanistan, and talk about how the United States is currently bogged down in that war in Afghanistan. Make that connection to make your argument stronger, or destabilize an argument. You can also talk about terrorism. There's so many connections you can make with terrorism. I honestly don't know what the topic would be, or the prompt. I'm sorry, the prompt would be, but you can talk about le terreur en France. How, of course, that's more state. It involves a state entity, but you can talk about how it was designed to have psychological repercussions. When Maximilien Robespierre was literally using the guillotine to behead enemies of the French Revolution. Um, you can talk about the IRA, you can talk about Islamist terrorism today, Al Qaeda. You can talk about how states often use terror to create psychological effects and for political messages in the same way terrorist groups do. You can talk about how sometimes one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. So much you can talk about. Genocide. Genocide, you can talk about genocides that take place. Genocides have been going on for a while now. It's the intent to destroy a particular people. Um, you can talk about genocides that happened in the Native American context. Obviously, the Holocaust. Talking about the efficacy of institutions at preventing genocide, you can then make the link between the uh, Rwandan genocide and the genocide that took place in the Holocaust in World War II. So doing that is obviously going to help make your argument better, whatever that argument is, whatever that prompt is. So last and final word that I would like to make is just make sure you're drawing these connections. You know, it also does help you comprehend. Make sure you're making connections across time periods, just when you're reading the Princeton Review or the textbook or studying the material, because it does also make your argument stronger, right? So being able to see these connections and also integrate them into the arguments that you make in your essays is super, super important. It makes your argument so much stronger, so much better, so much more formidable.